Myths are a vivid,
Mm,
story-oriented genre, and in the form of film, myths
mm,
are the most public form of popular entertainment. Myths endlessly reflect our shared values, our aspirations, and our beliefs, usually in the form of good versus evil. And as usual, we love to see these stories over and over again. Children love to hear the same stories over, and some adults do as well. One watches Game of Thrones constantly. There are many offshoots of Tolkien's Lord of the Ring myth. So we have Fellowship of the Ring, we have the Two Towers, The Return of the King, The Hobbit, and they're not the only ones that have, follow-up series. Last year, we had the Avatar Part 2. Moving on with films again, we have the entire Marvel film universe. Tons and tons of mythology in there. Similarly, we have the DC movie universe, and it is a multiverse. So they go through multiple universes in there. Physics comes into play. With the upcoming Oscars, are you at all surprised that
mm.
today's topic is myth making? Because there's such a close connection between myths and storytelling. Therefore, a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for our 70-second presentation. Can you believe that? I suppose today's proverbial shattering of the glass ceiling, because that's what we want to talk about, right? In the business world, you shatter the glass ceiling. Yesterday's equivalent to that would have been fit the glass slippers, because that's what let you upgrade. You go from a plebeian life to the princess life. So if you walk in these kinds of shoes, your life is transformed. And that idea of transformation is at the heart of myth making, storytelling. Myths really open the mind to the spatial vastness of the imagination in the hopes that it affects a transformation. That's the whole point of telling all these myth stories. And that's been true from the past. We can start with Aesop's fables. Aesop was a blind storyteller. I think he was supposed to be a very ugly man, but anyway, he told moral stories with the aim to make us do the right thing, to be good, or at least frighten us enough to do the right thing. From Aesop, we have Homer, a poet telling epic tales. Unless we think it was only men who told the stories. No, no. We have women. We have Scheherazade, probably mythical herself. 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. And as goes the tale, storytelling really did save her life. I have to comment. I love this sort of illustration. Can you imagine the drawings? And there are present day myth makers with great stories as well. The Bible, the Quran have wonderful stories also. And there's a very, very fabulous storyteller of mythical proportions that is now emerging. We live in very interesting times, and we'll get to that one very soon. So the Nourishment Projects is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. The list, seemingly small, is actually very, very dense. So back to the glass slipper. This glass slipper will transform your bank account. It will set you back because the starting price for this slipper by Jimmy Choo is $4,000. Let's go to something much more priceless. Myth making in the ancient world as depicted in the world of film from the 90s, 80s. I think this is Harry Hamlet. Same story. It's all just a little bit of history repeating. We see it again about 10 years ago or 12 years ago. Clash of the Titans. It's that concept of Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey. But we have heroines as well. Wonder Woman is relatively new. She's a 20th century creation. And when creating new myths, they all have a fundamental same task throughout, no matter when these myths were created. They are there to help a particular audience validate a particular construction of reality. So they're there to, they have a goal in mind when you create these myths. So for example, the Superman myth was formed around World War II. It was an allegory of fighting the Nazis. So again, be it in the form of oral traditions, which was Homer and Aesop's fables, or present day movies, myths help a particular audience validate a particular construction of reality. So the psychological payoff offered to spectators of the movie The Matrix has to be the same as was offered by Homer to the hearer of the Iliad. They're all telling a particular story they want you to follow through and believe in. And so myths exist all around the world. Today, we'll be focusing on the Western ones because the larger story today is really about the importance of myth telling, much more than getting lost in introducing really narrative catnip, because there are many fascinating mythologies around the world, Japan, South America. One could get lost in that, and the illustrations that follow are so beautiful. But I have a larger story that I want to impart. So rest assured, the East, including Japan and China and India, have fabulous myths of their own. Her oral traditions, like that of Aesop's fables, have enthralled billions. And stories by the fireside in India had mythologies that included very popular elephant deities like Ganesh. In fact, many of the stories, which often comes in the form of a prayer, you chant these prayers, they're telling a story. So there's hardly a difference between the stories and the prayers. In India, they start with invocation to this god. You start off by saying Om Ganeshaya Namaha. And so stories across the board, not just in India, traveled down the Silk Roads. So these Silk Road networks were trade routes. And so they transmitted goods, but they also transmitted knowledge. So along the Silk Road routes, all the way from China, all the way to Turkey and beyond, you had knowledge being transformed in the form of myth-telling, which is also known as religion. So you have Nestorianism, Machianism, Buddhism, among many others. And so these myths reverberated through the air, protecting the wayfarers through these often rather perilous journeys, these journeys of trade, because you're going for months when you're traveling down these pathways. If the water ran out, you didn't have water, you're good as dead. The desert would swallow you up. So you need to believe in myths to keep you going. So the Silk Road had started about 2,100 years ago, but we're going to go back further when we do this story about myth. We're going to go back to about 3,200 years ago, to the areas known as the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, from where comes the story of Gilgamesh, the character Gilgamesh and his friendship with a wild man called Enkidu. The story of Gilgamesh, I guess you would call it the Epic of Gilgamesh, also includes a character called Utnapishtim, who had been tasked to create a humongous ship that was to be called the Preserver of Life in preparation of a giant flood that would wipe out all of life. I'm sure you guys are putting the connection together. Utnapishtim's storyline has remarkable similarities with that of Noah in the Bible. And the Bible did come later than the story of Gilgamesh. So here is Gilgamesh with his eventual friend, who's the wild man, whose name is Enkidu. And when I see this picture, I often smile and I think, look, oh, Mr. Sendak, I think I know where your mind had been. I mean, the connection is, to me, very obvious. The story of Gilgamesh included goddesses. So they had huge primary roles to play in ancient mythology, particularly the predecessor of who we now know as Aphrodite. In Mesopotamian times, she was known as Ishtar. So Enkidu, in the mythology of Gilgamesh, was made from the clay that the mother goddess Ishtar had left over when she washed her hands. So he was literally formed. A devotee of her temple civilized Enkidu. She taught him how to be clean, taught him how to love, how to make love. So eventually what the story is telling is that women gives the animal man, Enkidu, humanity, that women civilize man through the power of sex, among other things. So the enormously creative power of female sexual energy has a very, very different mythology in Christianity. I thought that was very telling. But mythology is not just down about people. There's mythology about objects as well, starting with the apple. The apple seeds the story of Western world through Genesis. You take a bite of the apple and look all the worms you uncover. And oddly, even before that, before the story of Genesis, and again, regarding the apple, this pivots around the power of desire, female desire again, the golden apple, I'm going to point to it right there, the judgment of Paris. Who is the fairest of them all? So Paris was asked to decide who is the most beautiful goddess, and his decision was germinated the Trojan War, because Paris gave the apple to the goddess Aphrodite, who in turn had promised him, if you choose me, I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world. It always made me smile and chuckle to know these goddesses were not above bribery. Anything to win, love for sale. So she won, and she gave him, at that time, the most beautiful woman in the world, who happened to be the much married Helen of Troy. But the fact that Helen was married was a very, very minor detail and did not impede the lust. And so then we go to darling Helen. You see right there, that is her mother, Leda. Her hands are guiding you to look at these hatchlings. Helen had mythical beginnings also. She and her siblings, which included a sister, Clytemnestra, and two brothers, they had hatched from eggs because their mother, Leda, had been impregnated by Zeus in the form of a swan. So the Greek god Zeus was very playful. And so all these creatures were truly heavenly. Long story short, Helen's original brother-in-law, because Helen was married to Menelaus before she was taken away by Paris. Agamemnon goes to the war of Troy, you know the story of the Iliad. Once all that is over, he returns home after the Trojan War to his wife, Clytemnestra. So remember, Clytemnestra is Helen of Troy's sister. All these are very interestingly connected. So Helen's sister Clytemnestra is married to Agamemnon. More importantly, as far as the story is concerned, to win the Trojan War, Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia to be guaranteed success while he was during travel. And then when he finally returned home after the war, he came home with a new concubine called Cassandra. And Cassandra told stories too. So imagine, in comes this lovely husband who has killed their daughter, comes home with a lover. How exactly do you think the wife is going to respond? You will be surprised. Clytemnestra greets him with a hero as a lover of her own. And that lover happens to be Agamemnon's nephew. They don't stray too far. And the two of them plan together and they kill Agamemnon. So in this picture that you see, those two weeping by the foot of Mother Dearest, those are her children with Agamemnon, Electra, and Orestes. I don't think Clytemnestra looks at all repentant, nor should she be. Anyway, so Electra and Orestes plans to avenge their father. Don't you get curious? How is it that they didn't feel bad that their father had murdered their own sister, Iphigenia? Curious storytelling. But anyway, as the story goes on, Orestes murders his mother, Clytemnestra. Now, matricide isn't looked upon kindly by the gods. And you see these three creatures hounding Orestes. They're known as the Erinyes, who are also known as the Furies. And like their name, they are furious and they hound him to exact revenge. Effectively, psychologically, you can think of them as his guilt. So this mythological narrative triptych is called the Oresteia. So this trilogy constitutes a deeply affecting study of crime and punishment. So you have Agamemnon, the libation bearers with his brother and sister plan to kill the father, and the Eumenides. What happens? How do they get judgment on Orestes? And so the Oresteia is, probes irresolvable issues such as the nature of justice, the conflicts between love and duty, the torments of moral decision-making, and among other things, the spiritual consequences of irremediable actions. Like, how do you live with murdering one set of your parents? So the Furies or the Erinyes drag Orestes to the court of Athena for judgment. And Athena eventually calms the Furies and suggests forgiveness. And initially the Furies are like, we don't forgive. We are called the Furies. What do you mean we forgive? We are screaming creatures. We don't do forgiveness. And she tells them, no, 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 you can change. You can transform. From the Erinyes, become what is known as the Eumenides. That is the name of the last part of the Oresteia, right? Because then they become known for judgment and forgiveness. And so even metaphorically, the mythology itself is about transformation, transforming the cycle of revenge. So you go from anger to forgiveness. So it's metaphorically transformation on every level of the gods, of the storytelling, of the court of justice. Because it's the gods who are playing lawyers in this court where the boy Orestes is being judged by the gods. So it's a very complex story, and it's absolutely relevant in this day and age also. But we're going to move on with the story, and we move on from Greece to the Far East, where India and her stories through trade had reached far down the eastern shores, including Indonesia and beyond. So Indonesian shadow puppetry is known as wayang kulit, and it's full of tales from the Indian epics, both of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are two major epics, larger than the Odyssey. And these shadow puppet shows, they're operatic on an entirely different scale. They go on for hours with elaborate orchestras that include instruments like the gamelan. And these Indian stories are adapted to cultural changes while preserving the core Hindu values that these stories were founded upon. And I found it so appropriate that the story of shadows sheds light on the ills of society in hopes of uplifting society. That is exactly what mythology is supposed to do, guide us towards doing what is right, the kind thing, the right thing. So again, globally, mythology is about transformation. So the Ramayana includes the often recognized character of the Monkey King, I'm going to point now down here, whose name is Hanuman. The Western world will be more familiar with Hanuman's brother named Bali, after whom this gem of an island in Indonesia is named. Bali is named after a character from the Ramayana. The world is very, very connected. Another famous Indian mythology is the Mahabharata. And again, we are linking mythology to films because I think it's a most appropriate way to show how it affects our life. And there's someone in here who loves film, whom I love. So I thought films were a very nice medium to do the storytelling in. So my favorite film adaptation for this mythology, the Mahabharata, is the one made by Peter Brooks. And there's nothing great. The reason why is that one of the villains in there is so super hot. So I always love this movie. But in the story, in the mythology, the woman, the main character, the female character, has 5 husbands. And before anyone who has not heard the story starts smacking the lips, purring with pleasure, this is going to be kinky. The Indian woman's mind will balk at hearing the woman has 5 husbands, till one realizes she had married 5 brothers. And so the Indian mind thinks, oh, 5 husbands, but yet still one mother-in-law. Works out perfectly. Story can go on. Life is good. And so good times roll. They're very practical storytelling, So another great aspect of the Mahabharata is a treatise on dharma, which is moral obligation. This aspect, this treatise, which is part of the Mahabharata, is known as the Srimad Bhagavat, the Bhagavad Gita. And it is this blue god character, Krishna, espousing moral obligations to the warrior Arjun, who did not want to fight his family members. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to run away. He wanted to suddenly found morality because he didn't want to fight them. And Krishna was like, no, 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 no. You cannot take that scapegoat out. You need to fight. That's your job. That said, apparently, a piece of the Hindu scripture from the Bhagavad Gita ran through the mind of Oppenheimer on July 16, 1945, as he witnessed the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. The line that he recalled in his mind was, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I think he took that quote out of context. because that metaphorical metaphor, the mythological metaphor has different interpretations. That said, mythology has many aspects, not just destruction. We have creation myths. So the creation of the universe, which is known as cosmogonic myths, we find that in Machu Picchu. Creation of man, as you can see, the creation of Adam, which is called the anthropogenic myths. And along with it, now that we've got creation of the universe, creation of man, creation of the gods, which is theogonic myths. The Western theogonic creation stories, these myths are eye-opening. I would like to gently guide your vision to that Sith in the center of the picture, the castration of Uranus by his son, Kronos. And when Kronos, the sun, throws away his father Uranus's genitals in the water, you heard me right, folks, that is the creation story of Aphrodite. From the foam that is generated in the water, from his genitals dropping in there, out comes Venus. The birth of Venus, as shown by this painting by Botticelli. I am pretty positive Sigmund Freud had a field day understanding the creation story of the goddess of love from the genital of her father. No mother, parthenogenic, almost virginal creation. She's far from a virgin. The Greeks gave him a lot to chew on, bite on. And as far as Immaculate Conception is covered, it really doesn't refer to Jesus. Immaculate Conception is the belief that the Virgin Mary was free of original sin from the moment of her conception. And this Immaculate Conception is not a story. It is very, very true. Behold, Immaculate Conception. Parthenogenesis, asexual reproduction. Virginal conception. So play along. Let's Christian this beauty that you see undulating down the beach. Christen her Mary. Mary here and her ilk in the zoos are truly or can be independent ladies, because these ladies live a very isolated life in the wild and they become extremely violent when they're approached. And so female Komodo dragons, even once at the Chattanooga Zoo in Tennessee, have given birth to hatchlings without having their eggs fertilized by a male partner. So they give birth to other dragons with absolutely no involvement with males whatsoever. And one sees this Komodo dragon, I'm going to point now right there, in a very unfair depiction. Because first and foremost, they don't go swimming in the water. They never leave their island because the food that they need is on their island. They don't leave the water, and thank God for that. Can you imagine coming across this if you're kayaking down the water and hello, how are you? They are extremely poisonous. The rendering of the Komodo dragon on this hollow copper globe, which is in the New York Public Library, is incorrect. But the saying on there, what it is saying in Latin right there is, here be dragons, is very true, because these dragons did exist on that map. This map depicted the globe in one of the first terrestrial maps that depicted the North American continent. Even though it's factually correct, it didn't do justice to the island in which these dragons exist. Isn't that beautiful? It has a pink beach, it has a white beach, it has a black beach, and I will be very careful to avoid this entire beach all the time. There are yet many other mythical creatures that have not been photographed. You know, Woman and Fish is a mermaid. This Skinneri is one of the characters that come from India, woman and a bird. I'm sure many of you know Man and Horse, a centaur. You've probably seen them in the, what is it called, Harry Potter movies. Selkies, there are lots of stories from Ireland about these Selkies. And there is one character who has often been photographed in their own form. And they're beautifully depicted in Japanese mythology. That character, viewed with deep suspicion, is the fox. Now, if you look at this artistic representation, this is actually a preview from a future presentation on an artist, a Western artist, female artist called Bertha Lam. She's criminally neglected, and the East Asian art collection at the Art Institute of Chicago would not exist effectively were it not for her. So I don't imagine why they ignored this artist. I will not. I'll be doing a whole presentation on her, and I'll show you her handiwork. It's absolutely beautiful. But I'm using it to show you that the Japanese mythology had foxes as cunning creatures that changed shapes and became humans. And again, back to mythology and movies. They have a global marriage. These two subjects go really well together. Japan's brilliant director, Kurosawa's Ran, had an unforgettable Lady Kaede. She put Clytemnestra to shame. She's no fool because only an idiot reacts instantly. She played her game outright. Revenge served cold. She was cunning beyond wildest dreams, but she had her own moral compass. And eventually, when she is caught and the general beheads her, he refers to her as a she-devil, a fox. Familiarity with the country's mythology really helps appreciate their cultural offerings. So one really understands what he means. Like, he cuts her head off and calls her a she-devil fox. That is why he does that. So can you imagine how bewildered I got when very recently I read in the magazine that a British designer had named her daughter Electra. And I kept thinking, what on earth were you thinking? Why would you name your daughter Electra? Baffles me. But anyway, so along with mythical creatures like the dragons, the Komodo dragons, there are mythical geographies, such as one of many. You have Atlantis, for the Greek ones, you have Xanadu, which comes from Samuel Coleridge's poem. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. All these are remnants of my elocution class from India. Can't get them out of my head. But this mythical utopian place called Xanadu was likely, in reality, this place called Shangdu, also called Chengdu, in China. So the Venetian explorer Marco Polo is widely believed to have visited Shangdu in about 1275, 13th century, because he refers to it in his travelogue, and he refers to it as Chengdu. And to continue this concept of utopia, the mythical paradise, we turn to the English poet John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost. It is one of the poems or one of the literature that the now nearly mythical creature of the story Frankenstein, that creature, the creature's process of transformation from becoming an object to a human being included knowledge, needed to gain knowledge to become human. That is a very big part of the story. So the author Mary Shelley had the creature reading Paradise Lost along with other books by The Sorrows of Young Werther. I think that's by Goethe. So the creature read a bunch of books. So John Milton's Paradise Lost was one of the books that the creature had read. What fascinated me about Milton was that he had gone to visit, of all things, Galileo Galilei, the Italian who had improved the magnifying power of the telescope, and by doing so had burst the mythology of the moon, because until that point, they believed the moon was a heavenly creature, perfectly smooth, flawless, perfectly spherical. And by him using the telescope, he had shown that the moon was a body of rocks, that she had a topography that could be mapped and surveyed. Science got him imprisoned, and Milton went to visit him. And so Galileo had shown him with the telescope that the moon was a body of rocks. Imagine that giant leap for mankind. And through Galileo, Milton viewed the sights of the heavens, and it was those thousand stars that blazed behind Milton's eyelids when he wrote, 20 years later, his epic poem, Paradise Lost. Ironically, or it's irony to me, Milton comes from a land that is still viewed almost mythologically, Great Britain. Right in the name itself, great. What makes it great? Perhaps her own mythology, Arthurian legends. All these legends are made up. There is no King Arthur. He did not exist, nor did Guinevere, nor did Lancelot. So very cleverly, to have a creation story worth telling and really hanging your hat on, This 11th century genesis of the Arthurian legends links one of its character, Sir Galahad, to the Holy Grail itself. Thereby, the mythical creation of Great Britain is tied to the Western god, Jesus and Father and all of that. Though it sounds lofty, this is nothing new because the Egyptians did this all the time. The pharaohs directly connected themselves to their gods. My interest in England is for a completely different aspect of mythology, of storytelling. It's the myth making of the fantastical creatures. You're going to have a lot of fun right now. Fairies. Fairy tales transform. They transform frogs to Prince Charming. We go from rags to riches. All thanks to a shoe and a fairy godmother. You can get transformation in a snap. Put the right shoe on. Or even in American storytelling, click your heels. It'll take you to magical places. But the reason I included this is that the telling of the story has transformed. Folk tales amalgamated across time and geography helped create these children's stories that we are familiar with. We often see them from the storytelling world of Brothers Grimm, but keep in mind, they're folk tales around the world with different, headings and different storytelling. It's wonderful. What we often find in the libraries now are sanitized versions of the original folk tales. I'm going to share with you one or two of the most salacious kinds. So, for example, I hope this is new to you. One version of Cinderella has an epic twist. The prince had a deep interest in slippers, for he had a foot fetish. I was weeping when I found that out. And I really thought, is there a Chinese version of this where he also likes bound foot? The prince had a sexual fetish for feet. That is why the slippers played such a big deal in the story. But it gets better. Sleeping Beauty wasn't always happy to be awoken. In fact, in one version, once she was awoken, she told the befuddled prince, "What do you think I've been doing for all these years?" Because he said, "Come live with me. I'll give you beautiful clothing. You'll have people serving you. You'll have a lovely castle." And she liked all that. But then she told him, "While I was sleeping, I dreamt a world that is much better than the reality you're giving me. So could you stop bothering me? I want to go back to sleep and go back to the dreams where I'm much happier without you." That's exactly what she said. Oh, it gets better and better. We don't get these stories in our books. Please again note that time and syncretism are crucial for mythology because it allows it to cast a very, very wide net. That's why these stories start with once upon a time. No time is ever indicated. It applies to all times. Just like in the story of the Bible, they say 3 wise men came from the East. Where is the East? Nobody knows. It's just somewhere out there. It's like that Spanish mañana. It doesn't mean tomorrow. It just effectively means not today. So once upon a time covers all time. So these mythical once upon a time stories are very slippery because they are catch-alls. So the stories, you have animal brides. And by that, I do not mean to say that the brides were sexy beasts in bed, but they could have been. What I mean was animals became brides because they became humans. So one story from Rome, the weasel, with the blessing of the goddess Venus, becomes human. But at the wedding ceremony, she spots a mouse and her real nature comes out and she goes chasing the mouse during the ceremony. Can you imagine that one? But we still stay in our framework. Stories need a villain. And sometimes it is the poor devil who's at a loss. So this is beyond the story of Faust. There's another German tale where the devil rejects a blacksmith from entering hell because the blacksmith is so obnoxious, the devil doesn't want him there. So I guess you back up, you end up in heaven. In America, same thing. The lawyer beats the devil. Talk about To Catch a Thief. So I guess in this case, the term criminal lawyer is redundant, which is funny to say because the brothers Grimms were both lawyers. What they did was that they gathered and they sanitized folk tales because the aspect of appropriation was not an issue whatsoever back then. So let's take one of the stories. take the story of Red Riding Hood. I'll get to it, but the reason they need to be sanitized, or one of the reasons they had to be, is because in the storytelling, sometimes the family tree went straight up and they were extremely intertwined, like the royal families, brothers marrying sisters. All of this happened all the time. It was quite a jumble. So in the Red Riding Hood story, and there are multiple versions that exist of this story. So let's give you a little map. This version of the story exists all over the world, in at least most of the world that we know of back then. So when the story was in Iran, the child in peril that the wolf wanted to eat was a boy, because little girls in Iran wouldn't be wandering out in their own at all in the middle of a forest. When the story was in Africa, the villain would be a fox or a hyena. And in East Asia, the predator would likely be like a lion or a big cat, much less so than a wolf. But here's the fun. In one fascinating version from France, the wolf is the victim, and he has a very interesting story. The story was the wolf was duped by Red Riding Hood to kill her grandmother because the grandmother was a very, very mean woman. And then, according to the wolf, Red Riding Hood had called the police and had the wolf arrested. And the version includes, and I give you in quotes, I did 20 years of hard labor while the slut inherited her grandmother's savings, which she coveted so that she could marry a hairdresser's assistant. That's the story of the Red Riding Hood. In this version, I don't think little kids get this version. Regarding other mythological tropes, we always see the beautiful nature and how it's so lovely and soft and gentle, as opposed to the menace of the Industrial Revolution, which looms, these factories loom in the mythologies of, Tolkien's Lord of the Ring. If you really think about it, Tolkien portrays nature as weak, easily domineered by man. Wrong. We are so solipsistic. Because here's a snippet of an alternative view. It might surprise you. The vengeful power of beauty. And I'm going to read it to you. You let your imagination play, although I provide pictures, because the words intoxicate. Just as the pictures, I think they will conjure in your imagination. So this is taken from a French story, and I really hope it moves you as it did me. So it is telling beauty isn't weak. The wildest flowers, like warriors accustomed to surmounting obstacles, launched an attack on the city and completely overran it. Meanwhile, garden flowers, less free, suddenly became libertines, climbed iron gates, overflowed their bronze urns, and trailed all the golden balconies. They broke their noble ties to unite with the vagabonds in a monstrous celebration, smoldering with forbidden fragrances, twining branches to branches, with mouths of ember and flesh-like flames. Roses licked corrupted marble and splattered long, pure columns up to their summits with stains as red as wine, crimson as blood. At night, these roses marked the skin of the pale, pale monuments with violet shadows that looked like traces of deeply dug fingers. Roses of all colors, from saffron to every shade of wine, from furious scarlet to the tender tones of newborn limbs, shouted out their liberation. They were no longer bouquets, but gangs of flowers. The capricious hordes broke into places, entering through cellars and attics, settling into places for which they were never intended. Their boldness resembled a military strategy. In a voiceless fury, their blush darkened quickly to the sulfurous yellow of desire, and like a lacework of snakes, poisoned without mercy, affirming their independence from humanity. The writing keeps on going. By no means will you ever look at a flower and think, oh, delicate beauty. No, no. Venus flytraps have nothing on this writing. So flower and fairy mythologies might surprise you still. With life beginning anew through death. So death's immortality is a common mythological metaphor for eternal life, because it lets you understand that you can transcend mortal life through death, because you just go into a different realm. That's why Egyptians have pyramids. They're just going from one aspect of life to the other. They view death very differently. So these are realms of mythology throughout, often animistic and found in the Himalayan regions, including regions near Nepal. You have a religion where devotees lived high up in those mountain caves. I don't know if you can see them in the back. I'm going to point to them now, right up there. These are monasteries where individual monks stayed. And at night, so you can see them a bit better in here. So these are areas of Nepal, bone religion. These caves glow even now, sometimes at night. This bone religion had stories about a prince who had left his kingdom in search of enlightenment. These stories from what is again known as bone religion predate Buddhism. And here is the syncretism of mythology, the one that I said, these are the two important aspects of mythology. Syncretism, because they take in nearby stories and time, they blend them together. Just like the flood stories of Gilgamesh are so similar to the stories of Noah in the Bible. The prince from the bone religion, his story is very similar to that of the prince Siddharth, a prince from the Sakya tribes of Nepal, who around 564 BCE, BCE means before current era, when he was about 29 years old, he had left the comforts of his kingdom to seek the meaning of the suffering that he had seen. After 6 years of arduous yogic training, he had abandoned all his need for self-mortification and sat down under meditation under a bodhi tree. And on that full moon of May, with the rising of the morning star, Prince Gautam had become the Buddha, the enlightened one. The mythology of Buddha has nothing to do with God. Buddhism has a lot to do with austere practices to reduce suffering. Not every religion, the mythology of religion, has to do with faith. Some do, like Judaism, not Judaism, sorry, Christianity demands that you believe in Christ. And I believe Islam does also. Other faiths do not. Some are entirely based on self-inquiry to have transformation for an inward ascendancy. And you go on an inward ascendancy to reach this permanent state of where you no longer transform. That's the Sanskrit word for neti. That means not this, not this. You are neither this nor that, in the sense that you're accepting everything because you no longer change. Everything applies to you. No further transformation is possible. So mythologies no longer apply. And so the idea is when one reaches that primary code, that is when you go into the inquiry, into the mythology of self. You start looking at yourself. Nothing exists outside. And the way of saying that, because I know there's a potter in here, it's that the clay can exist even without the pot, whereas the pot does not exist without the clay, because the shape makes no difference to the clay. Just like the substance that transcends the identity of rain and transcends the identity of water, of the wave, is the quality H2O. That doesn't change no matter what shape it shows up in. It's when you find that core thing that never transforms anymore. It's a permanent state. That's when mythology stops affecting you, because time does not change your identity. Look at these stories. What is the background of all these myths that travel back and forth globally in our world? I'll take one snippet of these stories. So if you take one of the stories of the Leviathan, right? It's this mythical sea monster. Look where it started. It started from northern Syria, about 1350 BCE. That is a mighty long time ago, about the character of Baal, the god of water and storm. This character changes a bit and appears near Jordan in the book of Job about 600 BCE. That character then changes a bit and becomes this character that we now know as Leviathan, this big monstrous fish-like thing in the water. This Leviathan shows up in India, syncretic again, right? It soaks in the culture, changes shape, but at the core is the same. Shows up in the Muslim stories of Hamza Nama. Now, move forward a bit more. That creature from the fish starts looking again in the Christian world, Leviathan, dragon-like. Eventually, this dragon-like creature becomes the sea monster in Melville's story, becomes the shark in Spielberg's story, becomes the Megadon in last year's story, and on and on and on. Stories reinterpreted as we transform with time. Myths are allegories for intellectual insights. And what a glass slipper we have offered now. The mythical storyteller that I want you to think of, the one that's going to change all our storytelling, is artificial intelligence, AI. And I am not talking about the ridiculous ChatGPT. There is no way ChatGPT will come up with the story of forbidden fragrances, voiceless fury of flowers. Got a long time to go, so I'm not really worried about that. The more potentially disturbing story, the myth making that AI can do, is how it is now interpreting ourselves through the study of the human mind. Because that the base stories that they're working on is that the mind and consciousness are the same thing. It is not. Supremely confident that the mind and consciousness are the same, they are mapping the human mind, and these myth makers are creating origin stories about the phenomena of being based on empirical data. They find no rupture in the belief, despite the fact, through all their mapping of the brain, they have no way of telling you where is a thought. They can never map a thought in all their simulations. They can't do that, but they're very sure of what they're doing. There's a book, I think, by David Chalmers, The Hard Problem of Consciousness. Despite all that, they're mapping the mind, but if you ask them where is a thought, they cannot show you. And so to capture the human being, what they're effectively doing, they're assuming that all that you are is your intellect. Are you your thoughts? I don't think so. Because you cannot capture the beauty of a flower by plucking its petals. You kill it. That is not the way it goes. That's why I find it so very fascinating. Generations went into creating you. Sum total of all your ancestors, hundreds of years, probably thousands, is you. How you choose to live, how you transform your life. You have the capacity to change the lives of those near your vicinity, and depending on what you do, massively out there. Lives like the Buddha or the Oppenheimer change the trajectory of history. Even if you don't change the trajectory of history, you can change your own life, your grandkids' life, your children's life, and the lives of your friend. And in that way, you become your own myth. You are the myth maker. We each individually are the myth makers I really care about in this story. Hardly anything else. It's really about creating your own story. And from day one, we've been crystal clear about that. That is all that the Nourishment Project has ever been about. It's about making yourself answer questions that cannot be Googled. AI will never do it. It cannot do it. People tell me, it's hard to map AI. AI is constantly changing. Guess who's constantly changing? Us. We're constantly changing. There's no way you're going to map this. Essence of the story. What are you? I wish you joy in that discovery. That is the myth making that I'm interested in, your own life. Thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing. And I would genuinely be interested. What did you think of today's story? Is it what you expected in myth making? I don't know.
I usually have something to say to you, Shoma. What interested me most was the last slide, where you showed something that says storytelling is about the love of learning. And yet, most of the presentations that you have made to us, I would put like the opposite way, that storytelling is the learning of love, because that's normally what you've been talking about. And it interests me very much if you would be willing to comment about whether you're talking about love of self, or where that concept, which has been a steady theme through almost everything that you have talked with us about, fits into this particular one.
Okay. It is, I think you said love of learning or learning to love. To me, it's the same. Like the more I learn about the world and how I reflect off someone else, I find me. I learn aspects of me. And when I bounce across one who accepts me completely, with whom I feel utterly safe, that's when I will begin to learn about myself. Absolutely safe, not afraid of anything else. I get to learn aspects of myself. There begins self-love. What am I? Secure and safe. One begins, it's almost like the spiritual way of being a child, that I'm safe to discover who am I. Therein I find love. Bouncing off. It's that thing like there is a huge difference in the way my Hindu mind, or not Hindu, my Indian mind approaches all this. In the psychological terms, they say when you're in deep sleep, you're not thinking. Whereas in our belief systems, my belief systems, you have deep consciousness. The reason you don't encounter it is until you have an object to bounce yourself off, you won't see it. It's like when you shine a light in the dark, unless it hits something and bounces back, you will not see the light. It's like if you shine a light in the middle of the dark on top of a hill, all of a sudden you'll see dust things because the light bounces off the dust. If there was nothing to bounce off, the light would just continuously shine out. When it hits something, it bounces back. In love, when who I am bounces against someone who loves me, comes back to me, I will either autocorrect or just keep feeding who I am and find out who I am. It's that concept of learning about me from someone who loves me so that I can get to love myself. Did I answer your question?
Partially, yes.
Well, and the
It,
answer is teach me then, Bill. I love you. Teach me.
what interests me when I think about Judaism and
Sure.
Orthodox Jews, when they study the Talmud, which is what ultra Orthodox Jews do all their life, it's always in pairs. And they stay together in their studying all their lives. And it's almost exactly what you are talking about. It's two people talking about things, reflecting how they interpret the meaning of the text that they read, that creates the love of learning, which I guess, yeah, was, as you'd explained it now, is the learning of love in the same way. But this dualism is at the center of how Jews learn the tradition, particularly the Talmud. It's called the Chevruta, and they stay together during their entire study life.
Oh, wow. I hope you have a good partner when you're studying. You need a sharper one than me. But yeah, the duals in the Hinduism, I think it's the duality of the man and the woman in each of us. To find that balance, we have both, and when we transcend it. I don't know if I
Yeah.
was able to answer that, but I'm glad I got a better explanation from you. It always helps me.
Okay.
Anything else from anyone? I hope you weren't bored by the story. I was foxed by the French storytelling. The Prince Charming and his foot fetish in Cinderella. I did not expect that whatsoever. I was weeping hearing some of the other ones. There's some really gnarly stories. We got
Well,
really his version.
that's amazing, Shoma, because every one of us has heard that story and watched the movie and read about it 100 times, every one. And it never would have occurred to me that that's what's going on there. It's fantastic.
But it fits, That's it. Anything else from anyone? In that case, happy. I hope you guys had a very happy Valentine's, because I do love you. I love coming here. Thank you for your time, and I wish you joy. Please take
Thank you
care.
for your time.
Bye. Nice to see you, Jack. Nice to see you, Pam. Nice to see everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.